All right, everyone, looks like we're going to get going. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on Vicom's webinar that we're hosting with Skybox Security, titled, Are You Vulnerable to Attack? It's a pretty powerful title and what we're going to be focusing on today. And please note that we will be recording this webinar today. So my name is Andy Jonak, and I'm the Director of Marketing for Vicom Computer Services, and I'll be hosting things today. Vicom is a 37-year-old IT solution and services provider headquartered in the New York metro area that helps organizations implement, optimize, maintain, secure, and ultimately transform their IT environments, and specifically their IT infrastructure environments. And that very much includes solutions to help keep organizations secure, such as offerings from Skybox Security. Let me also introduce the other key people for the webinar today. First, I'd like to introduce Manoj Kabe, who's Vicom's Senior Director of EMS, or what we call Enterprise Managed Services. Manoj and his team work with firms to help drive operational and security efficiencies within firms' environments. Also, let me introduce our featured speaker for our webinar today, Jerry Brown, who's a Senior Channel Systems Engineer with Skybox Security. His focus is empowering partners like Vicom and working with customers to provide customers with contextual, actionable security risk and vulnerability intelligence. We hope that you find the webinar and information presented today to be intriguing and, most importantly, useful, as what we're discussing today is something we see as very significant to the organizations we work with, ensuring that they are secure and helping them understand and act upon the vulnerabilities within their environment. So some logistics for today. The webinar is scheduled for 1 hour total, and as I mentioned, we will be recording the session today. Our presentations, you figure, will probably take us to about 45 or 50 minutes, and then we'll leave time at the end of our presentation for questions. But if you do have questions during the webinar, we will stop a few times throughout the presentation and open it up for everybody to ask. All attendees will be muted throughout the presentation, but as I mentioned, we'll unmute it periodically to give people the ability to ask questions, and then at the end of the presentation as well. So with that said, thank you again for joining us today, and let's go ahead and get going. So IT environments today are increasingly complex. We all know it, we all live and breathe it every day, especially in what we've all chosen to do for a living. We have environments that are on-prem, cloud, or a combination thereof, multi-cloud environments. But because of the complexity of our environments today and where they sit, how can we assure that we can identify vulnerabilities and act upon and address them? So security continues to be a top priority within firms today. That is the case, and that will always continue to be the case. We see that firms today have a lack of comprehensive understanding of their security vulnerabilities. They need the ability to be able to act quickly to resolve security threats and issues, and they want and need the ability to be proactive against threats and contain attacks right away. That's where Vicom and Skybox Security can help, and that's what we're going to talk about today. But first, what I want to do is take a quick moment just to tell you who we are as an organization, who Vicom is. So the organization that Manoj and I are part of is Vicom Computer Services. And as I mentioned before, we're a 37-year-old IT solution and services provider headquartered out of the New York metro area that helps organizations implement, optimize, maintain, secure, and transform their IT environments. And we do this through our people, through technology, resources, as well as our strong partnerships and industry-leading partnerships with industry-leading technology firms such as Skybox Security. We offer solutions around all aspects of IT infrastructure, including cloud, be it on-prem, public, or multi-cloud, solutions around IT and data security, data protection and high availability solutions, including disaster recovery and business continuity for IT, enterprise management solutions, which includes operations management and service management and the integration of each, as well as solutions and services around consulting and IT governance. Vicom also offers a suite of professional, support, and managed services to help organizations wherever they sit in regards to the maturity level of their IT environments, their solutions, and their needs. So that's a little bit about what Vicom is and what we offer. So what I'd like to do now is turn it over to Manoj Kabe, who's Vicom's Senior Director of EMS, or what we call Enterprise Managed Services. And again, Manoj and his team work with firms to help drive operational and security efficiencies within firms' environments. And Manoj is going to tell you a little bit about how we help firms in their security needs. So Manoj, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'll go ahead and advance the slides for you.
Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Before I hand over to Jerry, I just want to take a brief moment and explain what typically entails in our enterprise management services portfolio. As Andy mentioned earlier, our focus has been driving efficiency in IT operations and improving security posture across IT infrastructure, what we call helping customers making sure the data center infrastructure, data center plumbing is healthy and secure. And the way we do is basically we follow modern security approach based on the NIST framework, as which goes through the 5-step approach to improve your security posture: identify, protection, detection, response, and recover. And that kind of builds your security framework version 1.1 as recommended by NIST. And we typically take a phased approach to help customer go through these phases to improve their security posture. And the solutions that we offer are explained on the next slide. So that, Andy, if you could go to the next slide, please. Yeah. And this is where we see Skybox solution fits into, as helping clients to leverage identification process of leveraging vulnerability assessment, penetration testing process, looking at some of the compliance and audit through leveraging some tools like Skybox, helping solutions for protect your environment using endpoint protection solutions or firewall solutions, implementing or operationalizing the security events by putting together a SIEM solutions and SOC for clients, and helping them to develop security incident response procedures by implementing security response platform and processes, and helping to recover data and putting together their plan for a contingency plan in a disaster recovery situation. So Skybox pretty much helps into the area of identifying the security exposure to security exposure and how we can help protect. And I think today that's where Jerry is going to talk about how Skybox helped to adopt the initial steps of this framework. And with that being said, I would like to hand it over back to you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Manoj. Appreciate it. So now what I'd like to do is I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Jerry Brown with Skybox Security, who will be introducing you to Skybox solutions, how they help firms, what they address, as well as give you a demo on what the solutions look like. So Jerry, I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to you and give you the ball in just a second.
Thank you, Andy and Manoj, for the introductions and the segue into our webinar today. And I'd also like to thank those folks who took time out of their busy day to join us for this webinar. So the question of the day: is your organization vulnerable to cyber attack? Yes. Now, why is it not advancing? You're sharing screen.
The worst, if you need to, if it doesn't do it, you go into the lower left-hand side, and you'll have the arrows that allow you to go back and forth if it's not advancing.
Yeah, it's not letting me do that. Stop sharing. Why is it? Oh, there we go. Now is it advancing?
Yep.
I must have really upset the computer gods this morning, so I apologize for that. So anyway, in a word, yes. So as I'm sure it comes no surprise to most of you out there, every organization is vulnerable to cybersecurity attack. And actually, you can put it in another way. It's not really a question of if, but when you'll be hacked and the severity of the hack. So why is that? Well, first of all, there's no shortage of vulnerabilities. From this excerpt from our 2019 Vulnerability and Threat Trends report that Skybox publishes, we can see that in 2018, there were 16,412 new vulnerabilities that were published with CVEs. So that's about a 12% increase over the previous year of 14,595. And we expect this trend to continue. And in addition to that, these new vulnerabilities, these thousands of new vulnerabilities every year, are being added to the world total. So the last time I checked in our Skybox Vulnerability Dictionary, it was 80-some thousand, nearly 90,000, the total number of vulnerabilities that are known in the world. So again, no shortage of vulnerabilities. Secondly, there's no shortage of attack weapons. So some of the examples are that we can look at indiscriminate attacks using vehicles such as WannaCry or Petya, targeted destructive attacks using vehicles such as Shamoon or Stuxnet, cyber warfare. Some examples of that would be the Ukraine power grid, which we probably remember from a few years ago, and closer to home, the Democratic National Committee. Corporate espionage, so Sony Pictures and Adobe and others, of course. Stolen login credentials and email addresses, PlayStation and Yahoo being a couple of examples. Credit card, financial data. I'm sure that we all remember Equifax, and then of course Visa, MasterCard, Target, and others as well. And then finally in this list here, medical data. So Anthem, I think we probably remember that, was a pretty big one. Slightly less well known, but still important, Premera, Blue Cross, and CareFirst. So we can see from this list, there's not only a diversity of attack vectors, if you will, or attack vehicles is probably a little bit more correct. There is also a huge diversity of targets, so that basically no industry segment is immune to being targeted. So the bottom line, vulnerabilities, or the number of vulnerabilities, continue to increase at an unprecedented rate. The number of exploits and associated crimeware continue to rise as well. Additionally, cloud, healthcare, and OT networks dramatically increase the attack surface. There's also little to no visibility into today's large complex networks. Information overload from traditional security tools. I'm sure a number of you folks have been the recipient of a 200 or 300 page scan report, and you've probably sat there at your desk and thought, well, now what do I do with this? So, and finally, old exploits don't go away. As we talked about just a minute ago, we pointed out Shamoon and WannaCry. Well, Shamoon was first debuted in about 2012 when it was used against the Saudi Aramco. It actually has risen, it's shown its head again here recently with a few other attacks as well. WannaCry was 2017. It again has been surfacing lately. And then actually, we're talking about new vulnerabilities. Just I think it was maybe 2 weeks ago, Bluekeep was announced by Microsoft. Now, this is a vulnerability that's been published. There hasn't been any detection of exploits as yet, but that's certain to come because that's sort of the way these things go. And by the way, this newest vulnerability is in Skybox's vulnerability dictionary. So it's pretty apparent from the news that we see every single day that the traditional approach to IT cybersecurity is just not effective against today's threat landscape. So as cybersecurity practitioners, what do we do? So here I'd like to take just a step back and just kind of look at what the traditional cybersecurity processes have looked like. I think a good analogy is driving a car. When you're driving, how much time do you spend looking in the rearview mirror? Maybe 5%, 10%, something like that. Most of your time is spent looking out the windshield. So this is actually, I think, a good analogy to the IT cybersecurity processes in the past, where they've been essentially focused on basically the past history. They've looked at things that like SIMs and other log management solutions to try to understand, or actually try to ferret out indicators of compromise. What I'd like to introduce us to is Skybox's concept of indicators of exposure. So if we look at the two here, we can see indicators of compromise. They're forensic artifacts observed on a network signifying there may have been an intrusion. So again, this is something we've gotten from a log, which typically is looking at traffic patterns, access patterns, those sorts of things, versus indicators of exposure. So an indicator of exposure is a weakness in the IT system that could be exploited or be used for exploitation. So essentially, this is a way for us now to get out of the looking in the rearview mirror mode into looking out the windshield. So the idea is for us to be proactive rather than reactive. Now, let me say here that I'm not advocating that folks go out and and stop using their SIMs. Obviously, SIMs and other logging and log management tools have a place in the cybersecurity professional's arsenal. They're especially useful for things like forensics, for auditing, and those sorts of things, and definitely they have value. From a perspective of trying to be proactive, they are probably not the best tool. So again, I don't want to say, in fact, in general, what I tell our partners and customers is that Skybox's mission in life is not to replace any of the tools that you already have. Most of them are, have very good uses and are valuable in their own right. What Skybox tries to do is to aggregate some of the data that we get and interact with and integrate with some of these other solutions to try to give you better visibility into your network infrastructure, and also to help you in identifying areas where you can clean up, optimize things, devices, firewalls, etc., and also to help prioritize the vulnerabilities. So with that, I'm going to have a very short high-level demo of Skybox Horizon. This is essentially the attack surface visualization tool in a single pane of glass. It's not bound by logical or physical limitations, and it helps us to understand the security posture of an organization in a new way. So what I'm going to do here is, let's see if I can bring up Horizon. Is this coming up on the screen?
Hey, Jerry, it might be a good point here. It's Andy here, everyone. Maybe just open it up, see if anybody had any questions on what you spoke of. Maybe a good demarcation point before you show your demo.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Andy. Yes, please.
Okay, so, guys, everyone, I'm going to go ahead and just unmute everybody for a second. So it might be a little noisy. But if anybody has any questions of Jerry or anything that you just heard before he dives into his demo, please feel free to go ahead. I also sent a private note to everybody that they can feed them up through the chat to me privately, and I will pose them to Jerry later in the presentation. So does anybody have any questions before I go ahead and mute everybody again?
Is this like a forensics analysis tool?
So analysis is certainly a word that we're very fond of at Skybox. However, I wouldn't put us exactly in that particular bucket, if you will. Skybox Security is actually a platform of modules that does a number of different things, ranging from firewall rule cleanup and optimization to the lifecycle of rule management and recertification, and then into the vulnerability, the visualization and prioritization of vulnerabilities. So yeah, a long way of saying it's not strictly a forensics tool in its own right, although certainly because we do have historical data in the system that there are some forensic uses for it. Does that answer your question?
Excellent. Thank you,
Yeah,
Jerry.
thank you.
Any other questions anybody that might have before Jerry dives into his demo? Okay. Well, Jerry, I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody then, and make sure that you have. Okay, Jerry, you're good to go.
Great. So yeah, as I started to say just a minute ago, is that we're going to take a high-level view, look at one of the modules of the Skybox security platform, and I'll mention here that actually this is the module that comes with any license that you buy with Skybox security. It's not a for charge module. There are other modules that are licensed and have various license fees attached to them, but this is essentially something that rides on top of the data that is gathered and analyzed and produced in the rest of the modules. So what this here is, again, it's in a attack surface visualization tool, and you can see here that we have a diagrammatic view of an organization's network. We can see that we have various sites, and we'll dig in a little bit later and see subsites. We can see that we have lines that represent connectivity between the various sites. And then we can see also that the sites have some differences in their sizing and also in the labeling. And from this view that we can see that the indicators of exposure, which we are going to correlate to risk, but the indicators of exposure, in other words, the greatest risk that is posed to the organization lie within the larger circles. And also you can see that here that the labels are actually darkened as opposed to some of the others. So, excuse me, we can see that here as well that we have an Amazon cloud presence here. We have third parties that represent partner networks. We have a backbone device, backbone that serves as connection to other branch offices and an MPLS network. So all of these, essentially, this structure is drawn from the model that Skybox built. In fact, here I might maybe just digress just a little bit to tell you about the model. So at its heart, Skybox is a computer simulation platform, if you will. What we do is that we ingest the configurations of all your layer 3 devices. That's your firewalls, your routers, your load balancers, VPN concentrators, etc. We bring those into the model. And as we're doing that, we can do best practice checks. One of the things that we can do is do best practice checks. One, against the configurations, we can look for default passwords and those sorts of things. We do in firewalls, we can do rule set best practice checks. So we look for risky ports, any and two or more fields, those sorts of things. So best practices around and rule sets. And then we also have what we call is access compliance checking. So this is where we introduce the notion of zones. And so I'm sure that most of you folks are familiar with this concept, especially if you're doing anything with PCI DSS or NUCSIP or something like that, that where you're quite familiar with the notion of zones. And so this is where we now can define zones within the network infrastructure, and then we can assess compliance with the access policies that are defined for that. So we can do this also, do this for regulatory sorts of schema like PCI DSS. We can also do it for custom, completely customizable. So at any rate, now we've built. To carry on with the thought there, I got myself a little bit off on a tangent, but anyway, so we've built this model, so then we can do a number of things with it. We can print a network map. We can ask questions of the model. So we can basically, because we understand all of the connectivity that's allowed within and without the network, and all the security controls that are embedded within that network fabric, we can give you a very accurate representation of how that network will behave and what traffic it will allow or disallow. The second piece that we bring in is the vulnerabilities. And this is done via, primarily we bring in all of the major scanners, so Qualys, Rapid7, Nessus, etc. We bring those in, and then we can basically compile the vulnerabilities that they've discovered into our vulnerability dictionary, which is made up of those vulnerabilities as well as vulnerabilities that we could imply that from, say, asset management systems. So for example, Microsoft SCCM or Red Hat Satellite, we can bring in those asset management data, and because we understand that there are vulnerabilities on a certain OS level or OS and patch level and the applications that are running on that asset, because we understand the vulnerabilities that are native to that asset, if you will, we can infer that even though that asset may not have been scanned, we can infer the vulnerabilities that could exist on it. In addition, we use from over 30 different public accessible sources, NVD, CERT, ICS CERT, TSBs from the vendors themselves, Microsoft, Oracle, Cisco, etc. We bring all of that into our vulnerability dictionary, along with basically a scouring of thousands of websites on the so-called dark web looking for the existence of exploits, the marrying of those exploits into exploit kits into malware or ransomware campaigns, and then also understanding whether those exploits or malware or ransomware campaigns are actually being seen in the wild. So all that's compiled in, done daily, brought into our vulnerability dictionary. So that's kind of it, gives us an overall view of what we're looking at here. So first of all, if we get back to Horizon, first of all, we have a couple of different high-level filtering mechanisms. We can see here, if I click on this here, that we can actually now change the filters that we're using. So basically, if we go to the default, low, medium, high, critical, we can see this. If we just want to see criticals, we can simply do that. We see the criticals. We can go back to here. The indicator of exposure. So these are some of the things that we can look at. And by the way, this is customizable. This is sort of the out-of-the-box view. But if there is a reason to key on other metrics, that can be done, customizable. So again, we can filter on things. We can look at just that vulnerability exposure. There we go. Exploited in the wild, those sorts of things. So this gives us a way of basically wanting to enabling a high-level view. You can also, if you hover over a site here, we'll get some information about that, a summary of the information. We can drill down into that site, and we see details about that site. So again, this is the U.S. site. You can see that we have various indicators of exposure. If we look at risky rules, for example, here, we can see that this is an enumeration of risky rules that are contained within devices in this site. Unsecure device configuration, again, the same sort of thing. If we back up here, yep, and actually I want to go one more. Yep, here we go. Go into the site details. We can see that following the schema that was in the overall layout is that this is basically a geographic layout of schema here. We see that within this site we have two subsites, Los Angeles and New York. If we drill into New York, we can see again the same sort of indicators of exposure, but we want to go into the details here. Now we can see that one of the powers that really is in this platform or in this visualization tool is that we've kind of diverted away from a geographic or a geophysical sort of grouping to now a functional grouping. So we can see that obviously the Internet Gateways subsite here has some critical indicators of exposure. So we've drilled down into that. We can go down into the site details. And now that we can see it, basically you've seen we've come from a very high level view from essentially worldwide geographic regions, now right down into essentially a network topological view. So just by drilling down, for example, we can look at the main firewall and we see that these are the risky rules on this firewall that are contributing to the high level, what we consider to be a critical level of indicators of exposure. So that was a pretty quick high-level view of Horizon. I believe we have a few minutes, and I would like to kind of give you a preview of our imminently to be released web UI. But before we do that, I thought this might be a good time to pause again see if there are any questions about Horizon in general, or about how we look at indicators of exposure versus indicators of compromise, or anything else that we've discussed so far.
Okay, everyone, I'm going to go ahead and unmute everybody, see if if you have any questions of Jerry. So if you do have any questions of Jerry around what he talked about, please go ahead. And Jerry, I have a few questions that were submitted, but they're more general ones. I guess we'll talk about those towards the end, though, okay, that people submitted.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Anybody have any other general questions they'd like to ask you, Jerry? The demo that you just showed to everybody?
So I have a quick question. I was wondering, this is Anthony from MFX. I was just wondering that, does this, based on deployable agents on these boxes and, of course, switches and whatnot, or is this based on just running the actual application off of the server and the server itself reaching out to those boxes itself?
That's actually a great question. Thanks for bringing that up. It's probably something I should have touched on. So I kind of like to say in a lighthearted way that no packets are generated, captured, or harmed in our endeavors. And so that's a lighthearted way of saying that. Technically, the Skybox platform doesn't even have to be connected to the network. Now, having said that, the vast majority of our customers, except those in some agencies that you can identify with three-letter acronyms, the vast majority of our customers do have Skybox network attached, and that's just mainly for the convenience of being able to get configurations and data into it, to be able to send out reports and alerts and those sorts of things. So basically, to answer your question, the Skybox doesn't do any scanning, doesn't do any pinging, doesn't do any SNMP walking, it doesn't do any of that sort of thing. What you do is that we have a module called the operational console where you set up what we call tasks, and these tasks use what we call connectors to connect to either individual devices, such as, well, let's say a Cisco iOS firewall, or to a manager of those devices, such as, say, Panorama or Checkpoint's R80 or something like that, to bring in the configurations and routing tables of those devices. And we'll do the same thing with the scan data that we bring in and PMDBs that we bring in. We would reach out to those devices and bring them in. We can also bring in syslog data, which is used for our rule usage analysis, so that we can they're basically in the firewall assurance module. We can tell you about rule usage, whether a rule is being used or unused, whether you have used or unused objects, also whether you have shadow rules or redundant rules. So this is quite valuable when you're looking to do firewall hygiene. We find that many of our customers can reduce their rule set size from anywhere between 15 to 70%. And 70% seems like a very high figure, but when you consider that some of these firewalls might have been in production, 6, 7, 8, 9 years, and maybe probably under as many different teams over those years, that there certainly is lots of room for improvement, or at least as far as cleaning up and optimizing the rule set. So, again, sorry, a long-winded way of answering your question. But yes, we don't employ any agents. We don't reach out to do anything except as you specified to do. We don't have any write capabilities, with the exception of in our orchestration piece. In our change management, if you want to, we can pre-stage configuration changes to some configuration managers, such as Panorama or Checkpoint's R80, those sorts of things. So, long-winded answer, but does that answer your question?
Well, you mentioned that it doesn't use the network, and then mentioned that how it uses the network. So I got a little bit confused there. Maybe because, again, the detailed answer that you provided was a bit past my basic question. But at the end of the day, if it doesn't use the network, in other words, if it's not intrusive in any way, then how does it basically gain an authenticated scan on that box?
Oh, so Skybox actually doesn't do any scanning, and actually I probably misspoke here in that it's not required that Skybox uses the network. It is possible. It's a bit cumbersome, but it is possible to bring in flat files, to bring in configuration files, to bring in scan data reports, in a digital format, and we can ingest that data from a local directory. However, as I mentioned, that the vast majority of our customers do use a network attached, simply because it makes it so much more convenient to go out to these data sources, right? Provide the authentication, and then bring in the data that we use to analyze. Is that a bit more clear?
Yes and no. I still don't know how you guys are getting all this information and all this data to ingest when it's not a fully authenticated scan on that box, and how that box is even going to allow your scanner to go in there and let it grab all that data. But then again, maybe I'm just getting a little deeper than need be for this type of presentation.
Well, so I think you know, and I apologize if you know, it wasn't clear, but actually Skybox doesn't do any scanning. We will bring in scan data from your existing scan tools. So if you have, for example, Qualys, if you provide, if you create a task and provide the credentials to access the Qualys service, and you can even define the scope of reports that you want to bring in, we would bring down those scan reports and compile that into our vulnerability dictionary. So Skybox itself doesn't do any scanning. Does that?
Now
Yeah, just to add on to this comment, you know, the idea. Yeah, just to give you a little more elaboration, you know, basically Skybox will read data from your scanning tools, your configuration management tool, which have information about your routing tables, your configuration data, and vulnerability data, and then basically Skybox is just a consumer to read the data, process the data, and help you to prioritize vulnerabilities and so forth.
got it. So basically, we provide the information from our spreadsheets, and this puts it in a graphical user interface that can be used to organize and remediate for the remediation teams to ingest so that they can go out and do the necessary for reporting, remediation, et cetera, et cetera. Yes?
That is correct, but I just want to elaborate. It doesn't have to be only spreadsheet. If you have access to Qualys, Rapid7, any scanning tool, we basically gather directly from those scanners. If you have a configuration tool for firewall, let's say Panorama or some other tool from Checkpoint, which you use to configure all your layer 3 devices or firewalls, we actually just connect to your the configuration management, and then get all the data, understand the vulnerabilities, process to the indicator of exposure metrics, and then help you to prioritize which vulnerabilities should you go after first.
Right, but then that, again, now that brings up a situation where it falls kind of against the General Data Protection Regulation, which is now giving my client's information to a third-party company to provide me a graphical report based on my Nexus scans and or my Rapid7 scans. It kind of goes against my governance and compliance for my company, actually. So I'm wondering how we get around that, right?
So actually, maybe I can cover a little bit about the deployment architecture of Skybox. So primarily, it's an on-prem solution. You know, as a customer, you may have a Skybox appliance within your own network, within your own data centers. It's available in you know, an actual physical appliance. It's also available as a VM, and the vast majority of our customers are using some sort of virtual infrastructure now to host it. So it can, in fact, it almost always does reside completely within, right, the customer data center. So there really isn't any exporting of this data out to some cloud entity or anything like that. I mean, it's possible. We do support an AWS image, but the vast majority of our customers have a virtual appliance installed in one of their data centers, is within the confines of their own network, and essentially all of the data remains sovereign with that customer. So does that address your concern?
Yes, now that you're talking about an actual physical appliance, yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't cover that earlier, and it's a bit difficult to provide all the background, but yeah, thank you for the questions. I mean, definitely, I want to make sure that we're clear about you know, about the structure of the architecture. Okay, so do we have any other questions on what we touched on so far?
So I guess my question is that what space do you consider this tool? Is this a SIM? Is it is it a reporting type tool that just, you know, takes information and produces pretty graphs and reports? What space does this tool setting? Because it sounds like a SIM to me. If we're feeding information into it and it's just going to categorize the information for us, is it a SIM?
So no, actually, we can integrate with SIMs. It can be a two-way integration with SIMs, so that we could bring in a syslog via from a SIM. We could also send syslog out. For example, let's just say that what we were looking at indicator for exposures in Horizon. You could get a report that, for example, would show that there are some indicators of exposure, and we could actually export that information to a SIM, and the SIM may triage, or based on whatever metrics are in the SIM and whatever processes it could do it. But no, the bottom line is we are not a SIM. We fall in what they call the SOAR category, if you're familiar with that. So we're really about a couple of different things, and probably I should have had an architectural slide up here, but I don't have it just handy. Essentially, there are a couple of different modules, and so one of the modules, in fact, one of the more popular modules, because it's very tactical, is what we call a security policy management module. And this is around firewall assurance and network assurance. So this is where, in firewall assurance, it's a firewall-centric view, where we do what I spoke about a little bit earlier, bring in the configurations, we assess best practice against the configurations themselves, against the rule sets. We can assign zones to various interfaces on the firewalls, and then we can assess compliance with access policies that have been defined. In network assurance, we expand that out to the rest of the layer 3 fabric. So we bring in the routers, bring in the load balancers, etc. And then now we can give you true end-to-end assessment about access that's allowed, along with other best practices, say on router configurations and the like. The other part of that, because it's so tightly of security policy management, is what we call Change Manager, and this is all around rule lifecycle management, rule recertification, those sorts of things. So it's a completely customizable module that allows you to customize the processes that you want to go through. And most of our customers that are at this stage of cybersecurity maturity actually have existing ticketing systems that they are using to at least capture the requests for changes. ServiceNow, Remedy, etc. And so basically, we can interface with those systems seamlessly to capture the English worded requests for change, bring them into our system where they get translated into technical requests. So to understand, for example, to basically change some English nomenclature for technical nomenclature, so IP addresses, ports and protocols, etc. We also do an assessment, and what we call an access query, to do an assessment of the devices that may need to be changed along that path, that access path that's being requested. And then we do a risk assessment where we look at the access policies that are defined within the system, and we also look at whether or not this opening up this access will expose any vulnerabilities. So that's the what we call the security policy management side. The other side, which is what we've been looking at concentrating on today, is really the vulnerability management side. This is where we actually use programmatically all the access queries and those sorts of things to understand how to put context around vulnerability. So as I'm sure quite well understand the concept that a CVSS score of critical, say 10 on a device that has that's air gapped in whatever way or has no access to it, doesn't pose the same risk to the organization as that same type of asset with the same vulnerability, say, for example, in a DMZ that has, virtually unfettered access to it from the outside. So that's what it's about, putting the context around the vulnerability so that you can prioritize them. In fact, here, this is kind of a nice segue into the screen here. We can see that when we're looking at this tab here in our new web interface, we can see that this model has 7,000 vulnerabilities. Well, that's a lot of vulnerabilities. here we can see that now when we put a filter on exposed and exploitable, so what we're doing here is we've run access queries programmatically under the covers, so to speak, run access queries to understand which of these vulnerabilities actually are exposed, and further, based on our vulnerability dictionary, which ones are exploitable, or exploits are actually actually available for these. So now we see we can come down to 1,000, and now if we come down to not the exposed, it includes directly exposed and secondarily exposed. So if it's a stair-step attack, that would be in this grouping here. Whereas this one, you can hear, if we go down to here, we can see that now we're from 7,000 to 75 directly exposed vulnerabilities, right? And we can see that is essentially, in a nutshell, that's the prioritization scheme. When you get your scan report, I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying the scan report is bad. We absolutely believe what Nessus or Qualys tell us about vulnerabilities. However, when you get a 300-page report, how do you prioritize which ones? And traditionally, many of our customers have, basically tried to just remediate the criticals. Well, the problem is, though, there's no context around that. And this is what we're doing here, from 7,000 vulnerabilities down to 75 directly exposed. So this is basically that 300-page report. This is what I need to go do today. Does that answer, or at least give you some more background about kind of where we fit in the spectrum of the cybersecurity tool sets?
Yeah, just to add on to Jerry, right? I think since that we have knowledge about your scanners and the knowledge about your network, essentially leveraging your network topology and the applications, the network, how the network is laid out, we are able to narrow down the vulnerabilities to the vulnerabilities that are important to you, rather than just looking at what's out there in the wild west.
Okay, let's see. I see we're actually coming up fairly close to the top of the hour. Andy, were there any other questions that have come over the chat, or did anyone else have any other questions?
Okay. Yeah, let me just make sure everybody is unmuted. Yeah, there were a couple which I think you answered. I'll read them off though. But did anybody else have any direct questions of Jerry that they'd like to share? Okay. Well, here's so there were 3 questions that got popped up privately through chat, and I think you answered 2 of them. So I'll go down the list here, Jerry. The first one says, does Skybox do any scanning of the network? I think you addressed that in your conversation with Anthony, right? So I think
Yes,
that's
I did. Yes, thank you.
Been pretty well addressed. And the other, I think you sort of addressed this as well. The second one is the Skybox solution an appliance? Is it a VM? Is it in the cloud? And I think you sort of addressed that. Was there anything you would like to clarify against that?
No, it's exactly as I mentioned. It is available on a hardware appliance, and some of our customers still do want to have something that's rackable and stackable. The vast majority of our customers use the virtual appliance, and we do have, as I mentioned, we do have an AMI available. To the best of my knowledge, the only customer use them is Amazon, oddly enough, but yeah, it is available.
Okay. And there was one other one as well, which I'm not sure if you hit throughout your talking points. It was, aside from vulnerability prioritization, what else can Skybox do? So I think you hit some of those points, but I didn't know if you wanted to expand upon that a little.
Yeah, no, I think I think that I tried to lay out essentially the modules that are available in the Skybox platform. And so, yeah, certainly vulnerability prioritization is a very large part of what we do. But we also find too that quite often, it's a journey to cyber security hygiene, so to speak. It's a journey, right? We all know that it's a journey, and quite often we find that our customers have a tactical project around doing, say, a firewall cleanup, or maybe they failed an audit and they need to get back in compliance for auditing purposes, or whatever it is. Those tend to be very tactical sort of projects, and this is where our firewall-centric platform or feature set comes in, firewall assurance, But then we find that quite often, as they see the capabilities, of the platform, they start to expand either into more areas of their network or across more capabilities of the platform itself into, again, the network assurance part where we look at all of the entire layer 3 network into change manager. And especially we're finding a huge interest in the vulnerability prioritization section that we're looking at here. In fact, you can see I drilled down and essentially we have an enumeration of all the different vulnerabilities that were exposed and exploitable. I can open this up, I can get some details on it here. And then obviously, we're not going to ask you to export this to a spreadsheet, although you could. We're going to create reports on it, and then you can basically then use that to send out to your remediation teams. And by the way, I should mention that not only do we tell you about the vulnerabilities and the context around those vulnerabilities, we also understand IPS signatures so that we could suggest that perhaps if you can't patch all of these, that you could deploy an IPS signature which would mitigate against that attack vector. So a number of different ways that the Skybox can really provide lots of value in prioritization.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Jerry. I'm going to grab the ball back for a second as we wrap things up. Excellent. So I went ahead and muted everybody as well. So it sounds like there were a lot of questions asked. Certainly, I figured I would give everybody a last minute if they had any. As we're approaching the top of the hour, we have a few more minutes. If anybody had any last minute questions for Jerry from Noj or myself, go ahead. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and just take about 30 seconds and wrap things up. So, okay, if there's no other questions, I'm going to go ahead and just mute everybody again, and we'll go from there. Okay, so thank you, Jerry. We went through questions. I think we addressed a lot of things. Great information. So everyone, thank you. Thank you again for attending the webinar this morning. We really hope that you found the information useful and, most importantly, relevant to your organization and what you're doing today. You will receive an email from me or your account manager if you're currently working with Vicom over the next day or two. But in the meantime, if you're interested in hearing more about any of Skybox's security solutions or anything else Vicom does or what was talked about today, please feel free to reach out to me or to your Vicom account manager. My contact info is on the slide here. I'll leave that up for a couple minutes as we wrap up. But we really do want to thank you again for joining us. And please feel free to share your feedback on the webinar as well back with Vicom. So thank you so much, everyone, for considering Vicom, and have a great day, everyone.